everyone. Welcome to the first edition of Between Two Lamps, the Bridge Initiative's live office conversation shedding light on Islamophobia. I'm Jordan Denari, a researcher with The Bridge Initiative, and I'm here with my colleague Nathan Lean, our research director.
Hi, we're here in our windowless office, and we're also live on Twitter, where we hope you will reach out to us and send us your questions.
Make sure to follow our hashtag Between2Lamps, and our handle is @Bridge.Initiative. So join the conversation there. Today we're going to be talking about Islamophobia in the 2016 election, in the fallout, the results from New York in the primary yesterday. So Nathan, what were your first reactions to what we saw coming out of New York?
Well, one of the things that I think has been so interesting over the course of this election cycle is the way in which Donald Trump's remarks about banning Muslim immigrants to the United States has sort of played out at each juncture. And after each state, usually we see polling results that show just how many GOP primary voters from one particular state or the other supported Trump's Muslim ban. So I think you have some data, am I right, on that comes out of New York in terms of the number of the GOP primary voters in that state that said that they agreed with Donald Trump's proposal to ban Muslim immigrants to the United States.
Yeah, so the exit polls yesterday showed that 68% of GOP voters in New York supported Trump's Muslim ban idea. And that's about equivalent to the average that we've seen across all other states where they've held primaries and asked this question. It's an average of 69% of all GOP voters in primary states that have asked the question, in exit polls. And that 68-69% is sort of kind of in the middle in terms of response. So in places like Arkansas and Alabama, they had a huge number of GOP voters supporting it. I think 78% in those states. So New York isn't quite that bad. It's 10 points lower, but it is higher than Michigan, where only 62% supported it. But still, in all those states, it's about 2/3 of voters, which is pretty concerning. This is a blatantly Islamophobic, discriminatory policy against Muslims.
Yeah, and probably one of, I think, the most blatantly Islamophobic statements and policy recommendations that's come out of the 2016 campaign so far. Would you agree?
Oh, totally.
I mean, to say that that we as a nation should just ban wholesale the immigration of one particular community to our shores, I think is really terrible. But the other interesting thing too about these elections is not only the GOP support for the Muslim ban, but in other states, in North Carolina, in Illinois, and in Indiana, we see polling data coming, not necessarily following primaries there, but just from the GOP in general, where there's a lot of support for other anti-Muslim policies. So large percentages of GOP voters in those states have said that they would express, for instance, support for surveilling mosques and things like that. So it's not just the Muslim ban that's a problem. Right. The Muslim ban is sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's the most blatantly Islamophobic kind of thing that we've heard of. But then there's a whole list of other things that are really concerning, I think, on that side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, the only other one that I think comes up there, along with the mosque surveillance or the temporary ban on Muslim immigration is when Ben Carson said that, I don't think we should have a Muslim in the White House. And I think a lot of people forget about that because he's not in the race anymore.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important for us to remember that, candidates that are no longer in the race, people supported these positions, and these candidates have gone on to now support Cruz and Trump, who also espouse, certain anti-Muslim positions. And I think it's unfortunate that people, I think, have forgotten Ted Cruz's response to the attack in Brussels too, because he said, we should patrol and secure, I think were the words he used, Muslim neighborhoods. And it got a lot of attention right around when it happened, but I think people kind of forget about that and just focus on the Muslim ban and asking that question. But what's so problematic about Ted Cruz's proposal is that what is a Muslim neighborhood?
Right.
It's not that we have religious enclaves in this country.
Yeah.
And I thought though that that some in the media, really major hosts of morning shows and Sunday morning shows pressed him hard on it. And I thought that was really fantastic. Nora O'Donnell on CBS, she really kind of stuck it to him and said, do you even know how many Muslims are in America? Can you name one Muslim neighborhood that we should surveil?
Right.
And he couldn't name one. And I think that proved to Americans, how misinformed and how misguided he was on that. At the same time, you have a lot of people that still support that position. So
yeah, well, and so one of the interesting things about that Nora O'Donnell interview too was that when he was pushed to name Muslim neighborhoods, he didn't really have that many examples. In fact, I think he mentioned Minnesota, which is not, of course, a Muslim neighborhood. It's a state with a very large Somali population, and then Dearborn, Michigan, which we all are familiar with in terms of concentration of Muslim Americans there. But they seem to be sort of almost, cliche examples. You would just happen to name the two places in the United States with the highest concentration of Muslim Americans as the example of the Muslim neighborhoods that you would patrol. But the other thing about that is that the sort of positive response that came from it within even the American Muslim community in terms of the hashtag that was bouncing around on Twitter, where Muslim Americans said, or I've forgotten now exactly what the hashtag was, but it was something like,
my Muslim neighborhood.
My Muslim neighborhood is what it was. And so, you had various Muslim Americans saying, hey, look, I'll be happy to show you my Muslim neighborhood. And it, was a group in, for instance, Michigan providing, cases and cases of water to the residents of Flint who were suffering as a result of the Flint water crisis. Or, one sort of poignant example after another to combat this very anti-Muslim idea that Cruz had sort of advanced with the idea of, with the suggestion that we should patrol Muslim neighborhoods. So
yeah.
But so what about let's kind of go over to the other side of the political spectrum if we can, and then we can come back because there's a lot to talk about within the context of 2016. What about the Bernie Sanders campaign? So Bernie Sanders released this new video. What can you tell us about that?
So I don't know if a lot of people saw it because it really only circulated, I think, on social media and then maybe in New York on TV. But the Bernie Sanders campaign released a new ad right before the New York primary, and it was all about Islamophobia. He didn't use the word Islamophobia in the video. He has before, but I have a couple quotes here of some of the things he said. He said, what people like Donald Trump do, or what demagoguery is obfuscating real problems and blaming it on someone else. And he talked about how this has been done throughout American history, how we've blamed women, how we've blamed African Americans, or fear-mongered about different groups, Catholics, Jews, whomever. And that kind of diverts people's attention from real issues. And I think that's a really effective message because I think so many people can relate to, they might be Catholic, they might be Jewish, they might be African American, and so they're going to realize that what's going on in this rhetoric, about Muslims is not what we should be talking about. He also said it's not good enough to say that racism and xenophobia is bad, but we have to go farther. And I think that's also a really important message. And he also said to these people who might not be, in the Bernie Sanders camp, he said, I know that you're angry, but Muslims are not your enemy. That you do have legitimate grievances. You do have a reason to be, fearful or feel like you need more security or things like that. But there are ways that we can deal with these problems without falling into Islamophobia. And, I think that the ad was smart in a lot of ways because clearly he was appealing, to the Muslim voters, the Muslim vote. But he was also, I think, trying to send a message to the entire electorate, And so even though he didn't win in New York, I think his message, and in general, I think what people have said, even outside of this issue of Islamophobia, is that even if he doesn't end up winning, what he has said really has impacted political discourse and things like that. And I would say that Bernie Sanders' rhetoric and Martin O'Malley's rhetoric on Muslims and forcefully standing against Islamophobia probably had something to do with why Hillary Clinton ultimately ended up using the word Islamophobia also. Yeah, and that's a really important point. It seems like in this election season,
the word Islamophobia has been used more and more, not only by people who are running for office, but just as a part of kind of the discourse that has surrounded the election season. So, whether it's Hillary Clinton or whether it's Martin O'Malley, or whether it's just someone like Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, who've been interviewing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and discussing kind of the fallout from statements made by people like Donald Trump, Ben Carson, and others. This word comes up, and I think more and more people are beginning to understand it for precisely what it is: prejudice and discrimination that targets the Muslim community. And in a lot of ways, it's unfortunate that it takes election seasons with really sort of heated, nasty rhetoric to bring us to a place where we can begin to recognize that there is this problem and that we need to deal with it. But in some ways also, my opinion is that is as harmful as it is, and it does have real consequences, that the silver lining is that these sort of moments of nastiness and ugliness do allow us, I think, an opportunity to recognize that this problem exists and to think collectively about how to kind of diagnose it and what to do to kind of reach a place where we don't have, or either we don't have it anymore or it's alleviated in a substantial way. So,
why don't we talk a little bit about Muslim voters? Because I think I mentioned something a little bit about that, and I think a lot of people have questions about who Muslims are voting for, and what do they see as important, and is the way that they're voting now different from how it was? Yeah.
So I really think the interesting thing is that a lot of people tend to believe that Muslims sort of vote in lockstep with one particular political party. And, certainly if we look at data from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, that recently released a new survey, what we see is that increasingly Muslims are leaning towards the Democratic Party, but it hasn't always been that way. And I think, this election cycle, it's not really all that surprising, because within the GOP, you seem to have, such substantial anti-Muslim rhetoric, and so it's not hard to see why the American Muslim community would be turned off by that, why they wouldn't necessarily want to embrace, at least in large numbers, and certainly there's a small percentage that do. A figure like Donald Trump, who suggests banning Muslim immigrants and all sorts of other horrible things. But so that is just to say that Muslims, I think, have voted in the past like ordinary Americans. Other Americans have. There are Muslims that identify with the Democratic Party, but then also I think maybe perhaps counterintuitively, but I think also for those of us that study this issue on a daily basis and are kind of plugged in to these things, maybe not so counterintuitively. Muslims in 2000, for instance, came out in large numbers in support of President Bush. They identified with his conservative social values, and those are issues that didn't necessarily line up at that time with John Kerry, who was running against. Was it John Kerry? No, that was Al Gore in 2000. I'm 4 years ahead of myself. Al Gore in 2000, and then again in 2004. John Kerry. But, I think, at least for the Democratic Party, maybe one of the things that is kind of at the heart of ISPU's findings in terms of Muslims going in the direction of the Democratic Party is that you have these overtures of social justice that tend to be kind of at the heartbeat of the Democratic Party right now, especially Bernie Sanders' campaign. The idea that you sort of seek to revolutionize not only how we do politics here in the country, but just to create sort of a more equal playing field for everyone. That probably has something to do with it. But at the same time, 40% of American Muslims support Hillary Clinton. According to ISPU's research, 27% suggest that they support Bernie Sanders. And most have leaned Democrat since the Bush years. Right. So before that, many of them leaned towards the GOP.
Well, and this data from ISPU is really interesting, I think, because I have seen tons of news articles and op-eds talking about Muslim Americans or American Muslim support for Bernie Sanders. So I think we might think that there's a majority of support for Bernie Sanders, when in fact Hillary is still the choice for at least a plurality of Muslims.
Yeah, absolutely. And on social media, the optics of it are, I think, quite different from what happens in reality.
Mm-hmm.
When you go home after work and you turn on your TV and you watch the returns, and you hear of kind of demographic trends and how various groups voted. That might seem surprising, but you're right. I mean, how often do we sit in this office and say, "Hey, look at this really cool article I found about this Muslim group in this state or that state that came out and support for Bernie Sanders," and so it kind of gives you the wrong impression.
Yeah,
almost,
like skewed view. Yeah.
A skewed view. Yeah. But also, so two other quick points about just Muslim voting patterns,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, or the way that they would prioritize things in the 2016 election is that they said, according to the ISBU poll, that the economy
Mm-hmm.
and that Islamophobia are their top priorities in terms of what a new president should address. They're equally engaged in their communities, but they're less politically engaged, which is, I think interesting. And so there's this argument that has been made that the anti-Muslim rhetoric in the GOP can sort of turn Muslims away from participating in the political process, right? That the nastier it gets, the more disenfranchised they feel. They don't feel like they want to participate in the political process when they view the political process as targeting them. But at the same time, I think the argument could be made that is precisely why they should be.
Yeah.
Right.
And as we wrote in a recent article, on our website, there are many Muslims that are running for elected office now, and so that could be evidence, I guess, for that argument that Muslims are getting more and more involved in politics.
Yeah, absolutely right, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit about something that happened on Monday. There was a day where American Muslim individuals and students went to the U.S. Capitol to meet with representatives to talk about these issues that they're concerned about, whether it's the economy or Islamophobia, things like that. And something made the news, and it was that one senator didn't meet with his Muslim constituents. Talk a little bit about that.
And that senator was Ted Cruz. So it's this annual day that American Muslims have. I believe it's called Muslims on Capitol Hill or Muslim Capitol Hill Day. And the idea is that the American Muslim community uses this day each year to go to Capitol Hill here in Washington and to meet with their either senator or representative and discuss issues with them that they believe are important. So obviously one of the issues this year is Islamophobia, this sort of fierce environment of anti-Muslim prejudice, but there are a lot of other issues too. I mean, it's not just that the Muslim community is focused on kind of the negative. They have concerns like all other Americans do, the economy, jobs, and a lot of other things. And so they use this day as an opportunity to increase sort of civic engagement, and which is really, I think, at the heartbeat of what democracy is all about, right? The idea that we would send people to Congress and that those people would listen to our concerns and hear us out when we had things to say, and that they would vote and pursue legislative efforts that reflected the will and the desire of the people whom they represent. So the interesting thing about this day on Monday was that a group of 14 voters from Texas, constituents of Senator Ted Cruz, had long arranged for a meeting with the senator and kept running into roadblocks. It became increasingly difficult to get responses. And in one case, someone from the senator's office responded to them and said, well, actually the senator can't meet with you, the staff can't meet with you, but we're going to direct you to Senator Cruz's Middle East policy advisor. And of course, that's odd because these were 14 American Muslims from Texas that wanted to talk about things that affected them in Texas, right? And them as Americans. They didn't necessarily want to talk with Senator Cruz about the Middle East. And, while that might have been something that came up, it's kind of odd that you would direct a group of American Muslims to the Middle East policy advisor. But at any rate, they showed up on Capitol Hill and they were denied a meeting with Senator Cruz. And so this is all very troubling, kind of at a surface level, but then when you dig a little bit deeper and you know a bit about the context and the history behind Senator Cruz and who some of his advisors are and what some of his positions have been when it comes to the American Muslim community and the Muslim community in general. I think it's even more troubling, right? So this is someone who has as an advisor on national security, Frank Gaffney. Frank Gaffney, obviously, with the Center for Security Policy, we've written a lot about him here. Frank Gaffney is the guy that said that, he said a lot of things. I mean, he said that Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, Abedin, is secretly connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, that the Obama administration's new missile defense shield logo looked like it had the crescent and the star somehow in there when they redesigned the thing. So that was further evidence that, Barack Obama, who Gaffney suspects was a secret Muslim or is a secret Muslim, had, submitted to the will of the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamic law or whatever. All of these kind of crazy conspiracy theories. But the Muslim Brotherhood is one of his hobby horses, right? So he has several others. Civilization Jihad is one of them, and we've talked about that on our website, bridge.georgetown.edu. But so the interesting thing about this group was that on Monday, prior to their arriving at the Capitol to meet with him, he published an op-ed in The Hill, which is a very prominent publication here in D.C. that talks about national politics, D.C. politics especially. And in the op-ed, essentially accused the Muslims who were going to Capitol Hill that day of being representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood. So these apparently, from his perspective, weren't just ordinary American Muslims that were coming here to meet with their congressional representative and have a conversation about issues that affect him. That there was something more nefarious going on. This was some kind of secret plot that these Muslims were coming from Texas to infiltrate Capitol Hill and kind of spread their agenda, as it were. This is sort of problematic, or really problematic, actually, not sort of, because Senator Cruz is the one who was behind a piece of legislation in the Senate, a bill that was introduced to designate officially the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, right? And so this was just a couple of months ago. As we were talking about this morning, it's sort of like this theory and this mathematical, equation?
The transitive property.
The transitive property, there it is. I'm not a math guy, so
I'm not either, but
but it's, help me remember, it's if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C, right? So if these constituents are members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is, according to Ted Cruz, a terrorist organization, then these constituents are members of a terrorist organization. So essentially what Ted Cruz was saying and what Gaffney was saying by Ted Cruz by refusing to meet with them, and then Gaffney, Ted Cruz's national security advisor, suggesting that these people were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, was essentially saying, we're not going to meet with you because you're members of a terrorist organization. And from their perspective, that's what was happening there.
Yeah, and the fact that this doesn't get a whole lot of attention is really unfortunate and really problematic too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it floats under the radar, and of course, The Hill publishing the Gaffney op-ed kind of caught me by surprise. Of course, I mean, they have the right to publish whoever they want, and that's up to the editors, and that's fine. But to have sort of a conspiracy theorist like that get such attention by calling out ordinary American Muslims, suggesting that they're connected to the Muslim Brotherhood in the pages of a very prominent publication like that is equally alarming. Yeah. So
I know that we're going to go to some questions pretty soon, hopefully from folks online. But one other thing I wanted to bring up first was something that I noticed recently, and it's part of, I think, a larger trend of Muslims in the media. I think, especially with the election, we haven't seen Muslims simply talked about, but Muslims are being featured more in the media, particularly where women who wear a headscarf. And so we've seen them featured in town halls and debates, posing questions, being invited on major news networks to talk about how Muslims are being portrayed. But what I thought was really wonderful was last week, Don Lemon on CNN was talking to Linda Sarsour, who is very active community organizer in New York City and in Brooklyn, and also has become a big proponent of Bernie Sanders. And so when I saw that Don Lemon was going to be interviewing Linda, I thought, okay, they're going to be talking about Bernie's outreach to Muslims or something like that. But the first two questions he asked had nothing to do with Muslims. Right. And I thought that was such a shift, especially given some of the unfortunate questions that Don Lemon has asked his Muslim guests in the past.
Ursula and Iftikhar, one of them, right?
Yeah,
Do you support ISIS?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so to see a woman wearing hijab being asked to talk about, being brought on as an expert to talk about something other than her Muslimness was, I thought, a real breakthrough. And I think we're seeing that more and more. And so that's one real bright spot. And I think people in the media or media makers or others are realizing that, we need to be bringing on Muslims, not when we're just talking about terrorism, not when we're just talking about Muslim issues, but, Muslims are experts in every field, just like every other, religious group has people that are experts in all fields. So I think that's a really great step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So we have just a few minutes left. I think it would be probably a good idea for us to take some questions from those who are watching, who are on social media. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do. Okay. So a question here from one of our audience members. Is Bernie Sanders' messaging to the Muslim community effective? Is it electoral opportunism, or is he taking a moral stance?
So I'll reiterate or rephrase the question a little bit to make sure that the audience can hear it. The question is about Bernie Sanders' messaging and if it's effective and if it's simply political opportunism or if it's a moral message. Do you have a take on that?
My take is a personal take, obviously, as just an individual that's interested in politics and that follows really everyone that's involved with kind of equal interest or maybe amusement in some cases. I think that it's genuine. I don't think that it's political opportunism. I think that, if you look at the trajectory of Bernie Sanders' career, not necessarily his political career, but also, his past involvement in issues of social justice. Mm-hmm. You see that throughout the 1960s and the civil rights movement, he was very, very much involved, including protesting on the campus of the University of Chicago, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And we saw these photographs kind of come to the fore recently and kind of revived discussions about, the Black Lives Matter movement and this kind of thing. So, that to me evidences the fact that he has a strong commitment to issues of social justice whenever they arise. And in the 1960s, it was the civil rights movement that was in need of, at least he felt like, that kind of very vocal support and active involvement. And now, it's, I think, why you hear him speaking out against, some of the rhetoric that targets the Muslim community, that there's recognition on his part that, a lot of these issues haven't gone away, but there are some that deserve kind of our attention.
I guess my answer would be that it's a little bit of both. I think if Democrats as a whole were not ready for it, I don't think that Martin O'Malley and Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton would have spoken out as strongly about this as they have. I think we can look back at previous election cycles, 2012, 2008. Obama didn't touch it. I think that personally Obama probably has pretty strong views on Islamophobia and things like that. But because it would not have been politically savvy, he wasn't going to bring that up or call out, fear-mongering about Muslims and even went so far as to, remove two Muslim women from the camera view at one of his rallies, you know. And so I think a lot of it has to do with our current political moment. And I think what's so fortunate is even though Islamophobia has gotten so bad, people are realizing how bad it is. And so, when I meet people just in my daily life and I talk to them about the work that we're doing with the Bridge.Initiative, they say, oh, wow, that's really important. That's really necessary. I don't think I got that a year and a half ago. I don't think I would have gotten that, 3 years ago. So I think people who are not Muslim realize that this is something our political candidates should be talking about and should be standing up against, and the politicians are smartly responding. I don't doubt that, Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley and to a certain extent Hillary Clinton feel that this is also the right thing to do, the morally right thing to do. But I think they might hold back if they didn't think it was going to be, if it wasn't going to have positive results for them.
Yeah, you're right. And so interesting how on the other side of the spectrum, the people in the Republican Party who were pretty good on these issues, Carly Fiorina, right? Chris Christie, I guess, until his endorsement of Donald Trump, which seems to be in contradiction to some of his statements and positions in the past. And Jeb Bush, even love him or hate him, really didn't have much tolerance for just sort of blatant anti-Muslim rhetoric. Didn't seem to do so well when they voiced those opinions to their electorate, right?
Yeah, I think it just shows, and other people have said this to Kingdom Come, just how polarized, we are as a society in terms of our political views. Something that's really popular in one camp is, political suicide on the other. So.
Yeah. Any other questions from social media world?
So there's several questions that have to do with sort of the Trump effect, the so-called Trump effect. Maybe you could relate that to your discussion about Republican candidates who flipped, right? They were sort of standing with Muslims and then suddenly became more on the side of Islamophobia.
Yeah, certainly. So, I think probably the clearest example of that really is one that I just mentioned, Chris Christie, right? A guy that, especially when it came to the sort of 2010 Sharia scare, right? This anti-Sharia legislation that started to pop up all over the place. And I remember there was this press conference that Chris Christie had at the time when someone asked him about that. What do you think about Sharia? And he said, I'm tired of hearing about the Sharia nonsense. Yeah. And he just really kind of put the question to rest and ended it right there. And it made it very clear that he wasn't going to buy into the conspiracy, that he had a pretty good relationship with the Muslim community in New Jersey, and that he wasn't a guy that was really interested in I think, sort of partitioning off one particular minority group and zeroing in on them with kind of heated rhetoric. But then, of course, Donald Trump comes along, and in the 2000 election season, this is so popular to certain kind of pockets of the Republican Party. And, I do want to emphasize that it's, even though it seems to be so popular now, as I understand it, it's not reflective of the GOP on the whole. And this is kind of getting into the political weeds, but I think it's only around 35 or 40% of, right, in terms of his votes. Of the entire GOP field. So, I wonder how that'll play out in an election. But I'm not a political pundit, so I'm not going to get too far in that direction. But the point is, you see someone like Trump come along, right? This nasty language, these really absurd policy proposals. And because of his popularity and because of the fact that anything that you throw at him doesn't seem to stick, he continues to rise in the polls. He continues to do well and win states and rake up delegates. You could have a situation where someone like Chris Christie, who's been pretty good on these issues, eventually ends up endorsing Donald Trump, which I think surprised a lot of people. Yeah,
it'll be definitely interesting to see where all of this goes as we move into the general election and how the talk about Muslims, changes or remains the same.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're out of time, it looks like, but this has been a great pilot episode of Between Two Lamps. We're glad that you could join us. We hope you'll check out our website, bridge.georgetown.edu. Follow us on Twitter @BridgeInit, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.